this percussion. It's streaming at the top of the hour. Top of the hour, it seems.
Yep, it sure is.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Martha. I was a co-seminarian of Father Ignatius. We went to St. Vlad's together, so he invited me to do this talk on St. Polycarp. And I just want to get a feel for the room right now. How many of you are members of this parish here? Okay. And how many of you would be members of another parish or visitors from somewhere else? Okay. Great. And just quickly, how many of you are Orthodox? Let's see. Okay.
Depends on whether it's a smaller word.
Yeah. And how many of you are part of a different tradition or no Christian tradition, I guess, or somewhere in between? I see a few. That's fine. Just trying to get an idea. It tells me what I can take for granted and what I can't. So I think I'm probably safe with starting with the hook, which is away with the atheists. And then we'll come back to that later. Okay. I also want to greet everybody who is listening to this via streaming or who is hearing it later via the recording. Just because of the way things are set up, you won't see my face too much, but hopefully that's not what you want to be paying attention to anyway. You want to be paying attention to St. Polycarp here. So, first of all, what does the name Polycarp mean? My husband gave me the joke this afternoon that many people do, which is it means a lot of fish. It does not. It does not mean a lot of carp or any other type of fish. In fact, it means many fruits or fruitful. So hence my background, which has some lovely persimmons here hanging from a local nature park. All right, so who was Polycarp? Polycarp was, you'll see he was a great symbol of continuity for the early church. He was a direct disciple of John the Evangelist, that is the same John who wrote the Gospel of John, wrote the book of Revelation, who was exiled to Patmos. And according to Jerome, who wrote a lot of biographies of people from the early centuries of Christianity, said he, Polycarp, saw and had as teachers some of the apostles and of those who had seen the Lord, which is to say, Polycarp was not an eyewitness of Jesus, but he had as teachers many people who were. He was a colleague of Ignatius of Antioch, again the patron of the priest here. A little bit, basically he and Ignatius had kind of a older brother, younger brother, or spiritual father, spiritual son relationship. He was an opponent of a guy named, sometimes pronounced Marcion, sometimes pronounced Marcion. I'm going to go with Marcion, who would have been one of the early Gnostics. He was the mentor of Irenaeus of Lyon, another very prominent one of the early church fathers. And his day job was he was the bishop of Smyrna and the head of all Asia. At this point, there were quite a few churches in Asia, which is what we would now refer to as Turkey. And there was kind of a rivalry between several of them, Ephesus, Pergamon, and Smyrna, but he held the title of Bishop of Smyrna and head of all Asia. He was a theologian, he was a martyr, which is what he's largely remembered for, Intriguingly, he's known mostly through the writings of others. He could read and write. We have an epistle of his, but that doesn't seem to have been his preferred method of communication. He much more preferred to teach, and as you'll see a little bit later on, when he wanted to have a theological debate, he didn't like to write letters, he liked to go in person. So, that's Polycarp. Okay, so what's Smyrna? Smyrna is right here. Okay? I like this map because it shows not only the location of Smyrna and other cities, but these are in fact the 7, basically these 7 here are the 7 churches that are written to in the book of Revelation. There's a letter that's sent to each one. Patmos here, this island, is where John was writing from. As you may know, according to our tradition, of the 12 disciples, the only one who was not martyred was John the Evangelist. So he outlived the other 11. He was exiled to Patmos. There's been a suggestion by some historians that why exile? Well, one of the reasons somebody could be exiled was things like astrology, sorcery, the equivalent of witchcraft, the idea of this is somebody you don't want in your community, so they might be banished or exiled. And as we'll see, the idea of having a bad sort of religion that was disrupting the good order of the empire, and of course, civic and religious life were very closely knit. That wasn't somebody that the Romans tended to want in their neighborhood. Okay, very old city. Among the people who have come through Smyrna, Alexander the Great, right, about 300 years before Christ. Most of the city got knocked down by an earthquake in 178 AD. Marcus Aurelius sent a lot of money to have it rebuilt. All right, so he came through. In 1402, Tamerlane came through. And in 1922, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk came through. All right, so those are just some of the ideas. You can see it's very prominently located, lovely port there. So obviously quite a strategic city, both economically and militarily. And yes, it did have an early Christian community. It is such an early Christian community that we do see it mentioned in the book of Revelation. And I want to read to you the letter to the Smyrnaeans in the book of Revelation because this, many of the ideas in this letter you're going to see repeated over and over again. So this is from chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. And incidentally, I'm using the RSV translation here. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words, the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, and you will be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who conquers shall not be hurt by the second death. So this short letter here is very much an idea of stand fast, be firm, show courage in the face of tribulation. In case you want to visit, this is what it looks like today. All right? You can still check out Smyrna. It's now called Izmir. This here is a clock tower. I believe it was put up in 1901, and it's one of the prominent landmarks in the city. There. So, I now want to get into some of the life, basically, of Polycarp. We know he was born about AD 70. And he was probably a native of Smyrna, of that area. He was taught directly by John the Evangelist. Another person taught directly by John the Evangelist, or someone who knew John the Evangelist very well, was Ignatius of Antioch. Again, they had kind of a mentor-protege relationship, older brother, younger brother relationship. In about 108, Ignatius was arrested and taken to Rome to be martyred. This took a while. And during his trip, he got a chance to write 7 letters. 6 of these were to church communities, including a letter to the Smyrnaeans, basically Polycarp's church, one of which was directly to Polycarp himself. And Ignatius reaffirms this idea that you've already heard in Revelation, that to be strong and hold fast to what you've received. So Ignatius writes, I entreat you, by the grace with which you are clothed, to press forward in your course and to exhort all that they may be saved. Maintain your position with all care, both in the flesh and spirit. Have a regard to preserve unity. Let not those who seem worthy of credit but teach strange doctrines fill you with apprehension. Stand firm, as does an anvil which is beaten. It is the part of a noble athlete to be wounded and yet to conquer, and especially we ought to bear all things for the sake of God, that he also may bear with us. So these would have been more or less this was the last message that Ignatius gave to Polycarp. Polycarp obviously took it to heart. And then he was invited, that's the word used, to write a letter to the Church of the Philippians. Obviously, we know there's a more prominent or well-known letter to the Philippians, written by Paul. The church in Philippi it seems like the church in Philippi wanted to know what had happened to Ignatius. And so they asked Polycarp about it. And basically what appears to have happened, judging by what's written kind of at the end of the letter, is that Polycarp had copies of all these letters from Ignatius. He wrote a letter to the Philippians, put them all in a bundle together, and sent them off to the church in Philippi. It is interesting, more or less, for what it tells us about the church at the time. There's nothing in there that's super poetic, nothing in there that's terribly surprising theologically. Could I have a glass of water? Would that be possible? Yeah. But it is very useful to see the quotations he uses and the exhortations he uses. He talks about breaking down, he basically breaks down the roles he expects each person in the community to play. He warns against heresies. And we do see a number of references, not just to the Old Testament, but now to the Pauline epistles and the New Testament, meaning that these writings, which we take for granted today as part of the Bible, were coming to be treated that way as well. Thank you so much. So, I'm going to read to you a little bit from Polycarp's letter to the Philippians here. And he says, I exhort you, therefore, to yield obedience to the word of righteousness, and to exercise all patience, as ye have seen set before your eyes, not only in the case of the blessed Ignatius, and Zosimus and Rufus, but also in others among yourselves, and in Paul himself, and the rest of the apostles. Do this in the assurance that all these have not run in vain, but in faith and righteousness, and they are now in their due place in the presence of the Lord, with whom they also suffered. For they loved not this present world, but him who died for us and for our sakes was raised again by God from the dead. Stand fast, therefore, in these things. Follow the example of the Lord, being firm and unchangeable in the faith, loving the brotherhood, and being attached to one another, joined together in the truth. So again and again and again, with Polycarp, the people who are speaking to him, the people he's speaking to, this entire church is just steeped in the idea of holding fast to what you've received and showing courage in the face of those who would pull you away from it. You also heard in that some references to the Pauline epistles. Not having run in vain, for example, is the one that jumps out to me. Okay. Moving forward, Polycarp, of course, had a number of people who listened to him, learned from him. Perhaps the most prominent would have been Irenaeus of Lyon, who was himself later a martyr and wrote this large tome called Against the Heresies, from which we get a very good explanation of the church at the time and the things it was dealing with. Primarily Gnosticism. Now, I don't particularly want to get into the incredible hornet's nest that defines what Gnosticism is, because there are so many definitions of that, it defies explanation. But we'll deal with it a little later. But Irenaeus himself was probably a native of Smyrna. He would have been a student of Polycarp. We know this because of what he later wrote. And he learned these ideas of continuity and holding fast to what you've received from Polycarp. And he leaves a very interesting letter later on, where he's basically writing to someone named Florinus. Now, Florinus had gone to Rome, heard some weird stuff, and decided to go off. Probably to follow either Valentinus or Marcion. So Irenaeus is greatly saddened by this. He writes to Florinus and says, "What are you doing? Remember what we learned." And he gives this wonderful description of who they learned from. "Well, I was yet a boy. I saw thee," that is Florinus, "in Lower Asia with Polycarp. I can even describe the place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit and discourse, his going out and his coming in, his general mode of life and personal appearance, together with the discourse which he delivered to the people, also how he would speak of his familiar intercourse with John and with the rest of those who'd seen the Lord, and how he would call their words to remembrance." So you've got this wonderful, vivid image of people just listening to this old man speaking about how much he loved John, what he learned from John. And this direct link back to Christ and the 12 apostles here. "Whatsoever things he had heard from them respecting the Lord, both with regard to his miracles and his teaching, Polycarp, having thus received this information from the eyewitnesses of the word of life, would recount them all in harmony with the scriptures. These things, through God's mercy which was upon me, I then listened to attentively and treasured them up, not on paper, but in my heart, and I'm continually, by God's grace, revolving these things accurately in my mind." So again, Polycarp, very much somebody who loved to speak, loved to bring things to life. And Irenaeus, who was a writer, mentions that, I didn't write them down at the time, but I remember them so vividly. And he's using this example to point out to Florinus, you were there. You remember this. How could you depart from this? All right. One of the things that Polycarp was involved with quite intimately, and we hear so much about early schisms in the church or early divisions in the church. This one, I think, is a wonderful example of church unity. Happened in the reign of Antoninus Pius, when Anicetus ruled the church. That is, Anicetus was the pope, ruled the church in that city. We know that had to have been the 150s, just because we know when Polycarp was martyred, and we know when these two people were emperor and pope respectively. It's this big question, when you celebrate Easter, right? At the time, the debate was, what day of the week do you celebrate Easter? Okay? And there was one argument from Polycarp, which he apparently had received through John, which was you celebrate it on the 14th of Nisan with Passover. If that's a Thursday, if it's a Friday, it's a Tuesday, you still celebrate Easter on that date. The church in Rome said no. Sunday's the day of the resurrection. We always have to celebrate Easter on a Sunday. And they both, when they talked to each other, they both said, well, that's what I heard from the guys who taught me. And Anakitas said, look, Clement and Peter, they say they always did it on a Sunday. Polycarp said, well, Ignatius and John, they said they always did it on the 14th of Nisan. And remarkably, they agreed to disagree on this one. Neither could Anakitas persuade Polycarp, nor on the other hand could Polycarp succeed in persuading Anakitas. And in this state of affairs, they held fellowship with each other. And Anakitas conceded to Polycarp and the church the celebration of the Eucharist by way of showing him respect, so that they parted in peace one from the other, maintaining the peace with the whole church, both those who did observe this custom and those who did not. Obviously, this state of affairs did not remain forever. We celebrate Easter on a Sunday. We always do. But I think this is a really nice example from the early church of realizing that they're both appealing to the traditions of their elders. Both of their elders were from the 12. That's why I picked this Coptic icon, which I liked a lot, showing both John and Peter there. And presumably they both realized they had bigger fish to fry at that point. Including these guys. All right. So, while he was in Rome, he must have come across a couple gentlemen named Valentinus and Marcion. I've mentioned Marcion already. Allegedly, Marcion spotted Polycarp and said, do you know us? He said, well, I know the firstborn of Satan. These guys could get very snarky. And this early image here shows John, the evangelist, rebuking Marcion. You can tell it's Marcion because he doesn't have a halo and somebody scratched out his face on that image there. John still has a halo and a face, so anyway. Now, again, just to touch on this briefly, both Valentinus and Marcion were part of this general movement known as Gnosticism. Marcion, in particular, taught a variety which accepted Christ, but said that the God who sent Jesus Christ was not the same God who created the world, i.e., there were two different gods in the Old Testament and the New Testament. They weren't the same. And Marcion had a kind of reduced version of the canon, which involved several of the Pauline epistles, part of the book of Luke, and that was it. And Polycarp as well, Polycarp rejected this, as did Anakitas and several others. So part of when Polycarp and Ignatius and others are talking about holding fast, don't be distracted, off the true path. This is what they're talking about at this point. It's this idea that there are multiple gods, that the God of the Old Testament is not the Father, God the Father, as we recognize him. And those really central ideas. So, after the meeting with Anakitas and tussling with Marcion a bit, he comes back to Smyrna. And this is where he meets his martyrdom, which happened about 155. Now, historians note here, you will see some people who say it was later, maybe up to 10 years later. Some people put it during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. But this is the majority accepted date, so I'm going with this one here. So, it occurred in his own city. This particular wave of persecutions, which appears to have only involved a few people, he was one of the last, perhaps the last, to be martyred. In the description of this martyrdom, it's mentioned that he was the 12th to be martyred. Again, drawing the parallel. John was the last of the 12 apostles. He was the last to die in this persecution. Now, the circumstances of his capture have parallels to the arrest of Christ, which is he was betrayed by one of his own. I will say that it appears that the betrayal happened when, first of all, somebody who was also part of the Christian community was threatened with torture and gave up Polycarp, kind of to save his own skin. So it wasn't as mercenary as selling somebody for 30 pieces of silver, but still the betrayal came from within his own community there. And then he was brought into the stadium. They do a very interesting detail where they say he was shoved out of the chariot and fell against the ground and basically either dislocated or scratched up his knee doing that. It's the kind of detail that says, this isn't a legend that was passed on over centuries. Somebody was there. Somebody saw this, right? And he was brought into the stadium, and a number of really interesting things happened. One of which is there were Christians in the stadium in the audience. They were watching this and saw this happen. And they say when he came into the stadium, there was a voice that said, "Be strong, Polycarp, play the man." No one saw who said it, but they heard it. Right? He was asked to worship Caesar and to renounce his atheism, to say, "Down with the atheists." This sounds a little odd to us today, because when we think of what an atheist is, it's somebody who doesn't believe in God or gods, right? In this context, what it meant was somebody who did not recognize the gods of the empire, right? Somebody who was unwilling to do that, and therefore was someone who was not just impious, but also somebody who was a threat to the civic order and potentially disloyal, right? So he said, sure, down with the atheists. You know, of course, looking out at the stadium and all these people who wanted him dead, right? But when they said, worship Caesar, he said, that's not going to happen. And he gives this, he says, 86 years I have served Christ. He never did me any wrong. How then can I blaspheme my Lord and my Savior? You then get this like darkly comedic bit in the description where the audience goes mad and they say, feed him to the beasts. And the guy who's running the games here says, look, we actually already sent the beasts home for the day. We can't do that. We can't bring him back. And he said, okay, then burn him alive. Okay, that we can do. Again, it's one of these details that say somebody was there. Somebody was writing this down. This isn't the kind of thing you make up, right? And the way the martyrdom transpired, they bound him to the stake. They set fire to it. The flames arched around him without touching him. And when they realized this wasn't going to work, they had him stabbed instead, and then they burned his body. And you get an interesting early example of relics, because the Christian community, after he dies, comes forward and collects all his bones as well. Now, I want to spend the last part of the talk discussing this specific quotation, which people say they heard as he was being led into the stadium. Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man. Because this both looks back to biblical sources, but also has followed us for the next 1800 years in a variety of ways. So, the idea of be strong and play the man. This shows up in a few places in the Bible, and I want to focus on a couple here. One is in one of the Pauline epistles, which is 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and it says, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13, be watchful, play the man, be courageous, be strong, let all that you do be done in love. Sometimes it'll be translated as stand firm in your faith or show courage. The other one that I find even more intriguing is actually from 1 Kings chapter 2. It says, when David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, play the man, keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do, and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart, with all their soul, there shall not fail you a man on the throne of Israel. So we see two ideas here. First of all, it's an exhortation to courage. Stand fast, right? Be strong, be courageous, show strength. There's also an exhortation to continuity. If you continue to follow the commandments of God, then he will continue to show favor upon you. And of course, what was Polycarp being asked to do, right? He was brought into the stadium being asked to worship somebody else. Yeah. The only time I found this reference to kings being used nowadays in a royal context actually is in the British coronation ceremony. And if you saw the coronation of Charles III, you would have heard something that the translation's a little different, but it's be strong, show thy worth, keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, and walk in his ways. And obviously it's a very direct use of this, meant to, the previous monarch has died, you're the new monarch, here's the exhortation, right? But in general, be strong and play the man gets used as it's quoted by people who are facing martyrdom. And I want to give you just three more examples, right? One is from history, the other two are from art. Actually, hold that, I will give you those examples in just a second. The idea of Polycarp as continuity, and indeed the idea of if you continue to follow the commandments of God, he will show favor upon you. This gets quoted by these early church fathers and used by these early church fathers. Here's Irenaeus again. It says, Polycarp departed this life having always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles and which the church has handed down and which alone are true. To these things all the Asiatic churches testify, as do also those men who have succeeded Polycarp down to the present time. A man who was of much greater weight and a more steadfast witness of truth than Valentinus and Marcion and the rest of the heretics. Tertullian here in North Africa, perhaps some heretics may claim apostolic antiquity. Reply, let them publish the origins of their churches and unroll the catalogue of their bishops, till now from the apostles or from some bishop appointed by the apostles, as the Smyrnaeans count from Polycarp and John, and the Romans from Clement and Peter. Let heretics invent something to match this, right? They're saying there's an unbroken line from the original 12 to these guys, Valentinus and Marcion, can't match that. So, Polycarp is inspiration of martyrdom, right? Just quickly. Anybody know this one? You don't count. Some of you may recognize this spire here. This is what's known as the Oxford Martyrs. Happened in 1553, right, under Queen Mary. Queen Mary was attempting to restore Catholicism after the reigns of her younger brother and her father, Henry VIII, who were both Protestants. She wanted to bring back Catholicism. She did this basically by passing a number of laws and having a number of executions of Protestants. These guys were named Latimer and Ridley, okay? And they were taken out to be burnt. And at the time, Latimer turns to Ridley, and you know both these guys read the Martyrdom of Polycarp, right? It would have been possible not to. Latimer turns to Ridley and says, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man. For today we light such a candle that by God's grace in England shall never be put out." Right? So they're evoking this idea again. And then, 400 years after that, Ray Bradbury wrote this book, right? How many of you have read that one? Okay, it warms my heart to see it still being read. Okay. There is a very vivid scene in it. As you know, this is a dystopia where books are, it's not even right to say they're banned because it's more of like a bottom-up banning. People decide they don't want to read anymore. So firemen go around, and if they find caches of books, they burn them. They go to one particular house. There's an elderly woman there. She refuses to leave, even after they've spread gasoline and so forth. And she chooses to burn herself rather than go with the people who want to take her books away from her. And she says, "Be of good cheer, Master Ridley, and play the man." So Ray Bradbury was looking back at this. Again, going back to Polycarp, the same idea of martyrdom. What are you willing to die for? And to the end here, I've evoked Orthodoxy, Protestantism, a number of other things. I'm actually going to end with a quote from Cardinal Newman here, who is a Catholic poet and theologian. He wrote a poem called The Dream of Gerontius in 1865, which starts out, "Jesu Maria, I am near to death." It's an old man, Gerontius literally means old man, right? Who is facing death, and then after he dies, the things he experiences, at the first beginnings of his experience in the afterlife. As he's dying and is trying to comfort himself, he says, "Rouse thee, my fainting soul, play the man, through such waiting span of life and thought as still has to be trod, prepare to meet thy God." And I think that's about the best way to end it, because if we look back at Polycarp, as well as the number of people who took inspiration from him, there's this idea that whoever you are, wherever you are in your walk of life, we must always basically be taking courage, preparing ourselves to meet our Creator. So thank you all for listening to me. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them now. And I'll turn over to the tech guy who says, just let it go through questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions, comments, or observations about any of this here?
Observation.
Yes.
The coronation rites.
Mm-hmm.
Coronation of George VI in 1937 still had the words "play the man."
Okay.
That was then felt to be inappropriate for his daughter, Elizabeth II, in 1953, so it got changed. I think that's a Charles III.
To be strong and show thy worth.
They haven't managed to get reverting to play the man.
All right. What does it mean? Act like a grown-up,
Act like a grown-up, effectively. You see it in a few different places. You will see, for example, even the Philistines, like when they're trying to encourage each other, say, "Play the man," or "Quit ye like men." meaning behave in a strong, courageous way. Act like a grown-up would be a
Fake it
good
till
way to
you
put
make
it.
it.
Yeah, well, it could be fake it till you make it, yeah, but in general, it's show courage, yeah, which does often involve a lot of acting like you're brave, and hopefully the emotion will follow.
Does that word, I believe it's undridzu,
It is.
undridzamide,
Yeah.
which has the word man in it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, Andrea is courage. So, but does that word show up in the Septuagint version of that King's passage? Is that what's going on? Because I don't know what Hebrew does that comes out as play the man.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it does show up in the Septuagint. Yeah, in particular in the Kings. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which was probably the Hebrew Bible that somebody like Polycarp
Would be
known.
using.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Masoretic text would have been much later.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I hope to be back here later this summer. So we'll see.
Yeah.